Good afternoon. Ooh, I wasn't expecting that. Let's be that loud. Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to an event in honor of REDress Day with Cambria Harris. My name is Kayla LaRiviere and I'm the engagement lead with Indigenous Engagement and Communications. I'd like to take this time to acknowledge the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe Cree, Dakota Oyate, and Dene, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. I recognize Treaty 3 Territory Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, the source of Winnipeg's clean drinking water. In addition, I acknowledge the treaty territories that have been left with a multitude of devastating impacts to provide us with access to electricity that we use in both our personal and professional lives. The University of Manitoba respects the treaties that were made on these territories, acknowledges the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Today we come together to recognize the thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people in Canada by encouraging learning and building awareness to end violence against MMIWG+. We understand today's topic is heavy, and with that, we're glad to have Carla Penner, from the Student Counseling Center to be joining us today. Carla can provide supports this afternoon, and if folks need to step out, you're welcome to head to the room right next door to our right. It's called the Quiet Room to access support throughout the presentation or following. So Carla, do you want to just give a wave? She's in the red back there, so if anybody needs to reach out. I'm honored to introduce our guest speaker today, Cambria Harris. Cambria is from the Treaty 1 territory of Winnipeg, Manitoba, and is also a proud member of the Reserve of Long Plain First Nation. She also became a grassroots MMIWG++ advocate after learning her mother, Morgan Harris, as well as 3 other women, fell victim to a serial killer in Winnipeg, Manitoba. She is a leading voice for a widespread movement called Search the Landfills, which actively pushes to search the Prairie Green landfill in Winnipeg, Manitoba, to get her mother, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Myron, and other Indigenous women's remains out of the landfill. Cambria is also a survivor herself and continues to share her work, her story, as well as work with victims and survivors each and every day through advocacy and community work. Please join me in welcoming Cambria.
Okay, so hello. I just wanted to start off by saying miigwech. Thank you for coming down here to share space with me today. There's a lot more people than I expected. That's always a good thing, though. So we're going to start off with the content warning. The following topic discusses the very real and ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited Plus. The following topic also discusses human exploitation and the crisis of MMIWG++. Graphic details will be shared, as well as triggering stories surrounding my life and my mother's. If you need to step out and take a break, I completely understand. So we already kind of did a bit of an introduction. My name's Cambria Harris. My spirit name is West Flying Sparrow Woman. I'm a proud member of Long Plain First Nation, but I grew up here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm a survivor myself, and I grew up within the child welfare system and throughout numerous different systems. My mother, Morgan Harris, was a vulnerable Indigenous woman who unfortunately fell victim to a serial killer in December of 2022 when it was announced, as well as 3 other Indigenous women. I am a leading voice of Search the Landfills movement, as well as a MMIWG++ advocate and activist, and I guess just an activist all around. I'm just a happy person most of the time. So, MMIWG++, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirited. It's a widespread movement across Turtle Island that pushes to draw attention to the rate of which our Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited Plus go missing or murdered. It's a widespread movement that pushes to draw attention to the rising statistics of which our women go murdered and missing each and every single day. And it's a crisis, a very disturbing and ongoing crisis that continues to affect the livelihood and well-being of Indigenous people across Turtle Island every day. And not only just Indigenous people, but the livelihood of our society and our own well-being. So we kind of just talked about that. But our Indigenous communities and families are affected by this painstakingly and repeatedly with little to no changes. And the only thing that does usually change is the high rate of which we go murdered or missing. This photo on the left here. So this is why this is so important and why I do what I do, because we feel like we are pushed to these measures where we have to draw a red dress on Portage and Main just to be able to draw attention to a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited Plus, just to get the world to just look, not even acknowledge, but just look. So before we get into all of that though, I always like to start off by acknowledging that in Indigenous culture, women are sacred. Our Indigenous women are sacred water carriers within our culture and society, for they are the givers of life who carry that water within them for 9 months and continue to pass on that beautiful life generation to generation. And our women deserve to be treated as the sacred human beings they are in both life and death. So we live in a patriarchal society that from the beginning of time has told Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited Plus what they can and cannot do with their bodies. Why is that? Indigenous women and our children have repeatedly fallen victims to men who continue to fetishize, target them, and take advantage of them repeatedly. But were you aware that the overall violence that we as Indigenous women face is so large that the government of Canada does not actually know how many MMIWG 2S plus cases there are? They legitimately don't, because the estimate is so high in the thousands that they actually can't keep track of it. There is no number. Not only that, we face a 6 times higher rate than non-Indigenous women of being murdered, putting a beaming red target on our back in a black and white society. A lot of people don't talk about that either. We as Indigenous women quite literally have a 6 times higher rate. That's a statistic that is repeatedly shoved in our faces that doesn't change and used against us. Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited Plus are actively and systematically being failed across Turtle Island. Our people and our women are often being victim shamed and blamed for the amount of violence that occurs onto them from others. For example, oppressors, serial killers, supremacists, people who want to target you for simply the fact that you are Indigenous. This is obviously not the case. And we are taking back that narrative, like myself, from those who stole it from us. We use our voices to speak for the voiceless, and there are victims out there right now, begging for the rest of the world to look at them and look for them. There are victims constantly in the shadows and these walls of society that are simply asking to be acknowledged. And that's the MMIW monument at Odena Circle at the Forks. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that little dome thing in the center, just past the Johnson Terminal there. And while the majority of the work contributing to ending this ongoing crisis is survivor-led, we as a society need to continue listening to survivor stories and listening to them and acknowledging them so that we may find ways together to address this ongoing crisis. And by that I mean while it's survivor-led, we as individuals in this society all have, at some point, a way in helping. Whether that be talking, whether that be acknowledging, whether that be frontline work, whether that be sharing missing persons posters, whether that be sharing a story. It all comes full circle. And the trauma of which the victims and survivors face is a lifelong battle and goes beyond any time frame or court battle. Grief can last forever. Trauma can last forever. It's how you work through it that changes. And this is a very serious and disturbing reality, not just for survivors, but for women and people across Turtle Island. And if we continue to acknowledge and speak about it, we are slowly and collectively making progress to address this. Learn, acknowledge, question, respectively, and address. It really is that simple. And sometimes people just want to be ignorant and there's nothing you can do about it. But that doesn't stop me. I continue to push forward. So misogynistic and colonialist views continue to push forward that normalization that we talk about, that normalization of violence against our women that leads to the discrimination that our people across Turtle Island face. And this shape of thinking which viciously harms our people, and the sheer and overall lack of progress to acknowledge these ongoing issues have forever shaped a lot of the way modern society works today. And this monochromatic society continues to actively fail Indigenous people across Turtle Island. And it's wrong and discriminatory. And we're going to kind of break that down. So statistical wrongs. There's a reason why I don't like using statistics, because statistics are merely a number. They repeatedly put numbers on our Indigenous women and use them against them. Everyone watches these statistics rise, but never asks why are they rising. Everyone always goes after the victim, but never the aggressor or the oppressor. That's a wrong mindset. So victims and survivors to these wrongdoings are left in the dark as these statistics continue to rise with little to no changes in either law, legislation, or actions to address this ongoing crisis that continues to affect our well-being. And the rest of society continues to actively watch these statistics rise, of the rate of which our women are murdered. And they're repeatedly used to normalize the violence against our women and people. But society doesn't question why. And why is that? This is a personal opinion, but I think it's fragility, guilt, colonization, delusion, patriarchy too, and it all leads to contribution and normalization. So we just talked about that. The statistics are skewed. They're not accurate and estimated to be much higher. Not only that, it's important to note that our people are so much more than a number or a statistic. We're human beings, and that's literally all we want to be treated as. If we really look at the overall scope of the crisis of MMIWG2S, it is evidently clear that there is a direct correlation between numerous different systematic failures that lead towards this overall crisis. That was a red dress painted at the Brady Road landfill where our encampment is set up, which we'll talk about later on. I got a breath over here. I talk a lot, guys. Survival. So, after that, it was the 60s scoop where Indigenous kids were forcibly removed from their homes and adopted into non-Indigenous families to strip them of not only their culture, but their identity, but of their language, but of everything they had ever known that was deeply embedded into them. Children in the 60s were quite literally advertised on newspapers and being sold to non-Indigenous families. One of my uncles was. That's how close it strikes to home, and that shows you that it really wasn't that long ago. My grandmother was a residential school survivor. In today's modern society, we have the child welfare system that displaces children from their biological families. Cities and sometimes hours away, we continue to watch statistics rise of Indigenous children being placed in care, where a painstaking 90% of kids in care in Manitoba are Indigenous. Think about that for a second. There's nearly, I believe it was, last time I checked, it was over 12,000 kids in care in Manitoba. That's 10,000 alone that are Indigenous within these systems. And nobody questions that. Nobody does anything to change that. And history today repeats itself in a more modern way today, under the guise of laws where jurisdiction and systematic oppression continue to fail MMIWG2S+ today across Turtle Island. And all of these systems that were just spoken about also pass on intergenerational trauma unfairly to the victims who experience traumatic events such as those. These systems that we just talked about, all three of those, all go down like a ladder, and they have a very clear and direct correlation to MMIWG2S+ from both, not only the parent who just had their kid ripped away from them, but from the child who just had their parent ripped away from them's perspective. But why is that relevant? Because there's always a beginning, right? There's always somewhere it stops. So where is it going to end, and how do we navigate that? We talk about it. Residential schools were a disturbing reality and attempt to colonize Indigenous children by stripping them of their language and culture. Children were forcibly ripped away from their homes and forced into religion and unfamiliar environments where abuse would sometimes take place that could have led to death. And if you really think about it, they were some of the first missing and murdered Indigenous people. A lot of people don't talk about that. If you look into the deeper retrospective of those events, there is a clear and direct correlation that leads to MMIWG2S. Children in care today are actively being targeted and discriminated against, and our people are being exploited each and every single day. And a lot of us grew up never knowing what stability or safety looked like, and a lot of people say, why? Because we were victims to those systems over and over repeatedly. And I believe that left photo was a depiction of the 60s scoop drawn by an Indigenous artist. I can't remember his name. Okay. I don't really need to say much on this. I don't like talking about intergenerational trauma because no one talks about intergenerational strength. What comes after the trauma and what happens when you move on? How do you move forward in a strong and good way? We talk about it as Indigenous people living that good life, to walk that good life. How do we move on from that? And that's kind of what I'm doing. But for those who haven't been able to wrap their head around or break it down, because it's hard. It took me a long time to understand that what I was going through was intergenerational trauma. It's defined as trauma that unfairly gets passed down from those who directly experience an incident to subsequent generations. So it can begin when a group collectively experiences a traumatic event that affects their overall being. It can be caused by extreme events that can lead to PTSD, mental illness, etc., and can surround events such as domestic abuse, war, racism, discrimination, or even systematic failures. Residential schools, child welfare system, the judicial system, and its effects on our Indigenous people today are many different examples of intergenerational trauma. This trauma, which a lot of people don't talk about, can also at times turn the victim into the oppressor. And I just wanted to throw this out there, that this is never, ever, ever the victim or survivor's fault, and the trauma of which they experienced and future generations continue to experience could be an endless cycle if there is no stop. So how do we stop it? The only way to stop that cycle is by starting with you and acknowledging or breaking that circular pattern, that full circle, that you may help the younger and future generations, because everything has to come around at some point. This I like to bring up, because a lot of people don't realize this as well. Indigenous human trafficking awareness. In a study released by the NWAC on March 24, 2023, so this was a year ago, which actually collaborated with 266 frontline outreach organizations across Canada, found that 51% of women and girls that were trafficked were or had been involved within the child welfare system. And 50% of those victims who had been trafficked were Indigenous. And nobody talks about that. That's a very, very scary statistic. Many of those who fall victim to these circumstances are not aware that they're currently being exploited, for the signs of exploitation are not being taught. Growing up in care, I know I was never taught that. I was never taught what a predator looked like. I was never taught what human trafficking looks like, and it's hidden in broad daylight. So I hope you ask yourself at the end of the day, do I know the signs? Would I know how to help someone in that situation? Kids in care are some of our most vulnerable population and often targets of predators. Did you know that every 2 kilometers around you, someone is potentially being trafficked? That was a statistic from the Joyce Smith Foundation here in Winnipeg. That's a scary thing to think about. So it's disturbing to know that this overall lack of action continues to actively perpetuate violence towards our Indigenous sisters. And those systems used to shape and govern the current world of which our people are under continue to fail to ensure the safety of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S+ across Turtle Island. This is Canada's national shame as we know it. Missing and murdered Indigenous people is a genocide. So according to the National Inquiry into MMIWG, back in 2014, Tina Fontaine, a 14-year-old, 15-year-old Indigenous girl, was pulled from the Red River. She was a victim of the child welfare system, and she was taken advantage of by a monster. And her death sparked a national inquiry into addressing this ongoing crisis. And I was 14 back then, and I was on those streets protesting for Take Back the Nights, begging for our women to be safe on those streets. So that's kind of interesting to think about. The 231 calls for justice, which advocate for those laws and direct calls for action regarding MMIWG 2S+, says the amount of violence and systemic discrimination faced by our women amounts to a genocide. And we're going to get into that. So what is a genocide? Genocide is described as, in proper terms, the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. It's a crime that is committed with the intent to harm a community or group, whether that be racial, religious, or etc. So what I mean by that, it means the aim of absolutely trying to eliminate someone for simply the fact that they are either one, Indigenous, they have some sort of religion, racial, etc. How does that fall into MMIWG though? Well, because if we look at that correlative system and those systematic failures and how this all leads up to today, Indigenous women continuously being targeted and murdered through acts of violence across Turtle Island does amount to a genocide. That high rate and the painstakingly high rates and rising numbers of which we go missing does amount to a genocide. And without our women in theory, And this doesn't go just to Indigenous people. This goes to any human being. Without our women in theory, we wouldn't have our children. And without our women and children, we as a human race would simply and disturbingly be non-existent. Our women are the backbone of our societies and communities. And if that's not a genocide, then I don't know what is. So, going back to present day and why I'm here and why this all ties into that. I like to start off by saying remember their names and acknowledging that on December 1st, 2022, it was announced that 4 Indigenous women had fallen victim to the hands of a serial killer over a course of months in the city of Winnipeg, Manitoba. These are those women. So Morgan Harris, that's my mother. She's a member of Long Plain First Nation. Mercedes Myron, also a member of Long Plain First Nation. Mashkade Bijike Ikwe, who still remains unidentified to today. And Rebecca Contois, who was a member of Crane River First Nation. 4 Indigenous women. So on the left here is actually a poster that I created over a year ago to help try to identify Buffalo women, and community members and Bear Clan Patrol, my family, and I hung these posters all over the city in an attempt to identify her. She was named Buffalo Woman by members last year and elders last year after it was announced that a Jane Doe had also fallen victim to a serial killer. She was murdered on or around March 15th, 2022, so nearly 2 years now, over 2 years now, and was the first victim. There is no known location for her remains to this day, and it's possible that she could have been from another province. Her family might not currently know she's missing, or they might know that she is missing and not know that she's over here. The only thing found that can help identify Buffalo Woman to this very day is this reversible baby fat jacket, and I find that so sad. Being an MMIWG Support family member, knowing that, well, what if that was my mom and the only thing they had to identify her was a jacket? And that's it. That's all you have. And I think she deserves so much more than that. I think she deserves to have an identity and a name, and that's why the community named her. So she remains unidentified to this day. And my mom. She was born on June 12th, 1982. She was 39 years old at the time she passed and was also a member of Long Plain First Nation, but grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba. She was reported missing in May of 2022, and her remains are believed to be within the Prairie Green landfill in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Today, alongside Mercedes Myron. They're both in the same cell. Morgan Harris was targeted and preyed upon at a homeless shelter. This shelter had become a predatory ground for this man responsible for the murders, and he would utilize these soup kitchen meals to sit down and pick out his prey. That's what he did. He had a home. He went into these shelters. He sat down. He preyed on these women, took advantage of their vulnerability, and murdered them. And if you ever wonder why we have so many vulnerable people on the streets, it's because shelters aren't even safe. They don't feel safe. They feel much safer in an encampment with their community that they actually know than in those shelters' walls, not knowing anyone around them. So shelters were no longer safe havens, and he brought her home to mercilessly take her life and murder her. And she had no clue that the night she was seeking warmth and shelter in someone else's home, that she would take her last breaths there. That's my mom in high school. There. And on the bottom is the first vigil that we held. So a lot of people don't talk about who was Morgan Harris. And this, I think, is so important because we watch these stories continuously over the news. And then we forget about it. We go on to the next story. But we need to realize that these are people's sisters. These are someone's cousins, aunties, loved ones, mothers. What if this was your mother, right? I think it's important to acknowledge that these were women with stories. These were women that lived a life full of lessons. And Morgan Harris was a fierce mother of 5. She gave birth to me at the young age of 18 and then had the rest of my siblings in the following years. And that strikes me so closely because I myself gave birth at the age of 18 and I'm the mother to a 4-year-old girl. So in 2 years, she would be 6 years old. And I think back to when I was 6 years old and when I got ripped away from my mom and how I want to change that and how I want to change that for the future generations so no one ever has to go through that again. We'll get into that a little bit later. But Morgan is remembered as having the soul of a UFC fighter and a smile like no other. You could not look at her the wrong way because she wouldn't hesitate to. She'd look at you from across the room, be there in 2 seconds, and oof. I'm not joking. Morgan loved being a mom to her children and sibling to her brothers and sisters. Oh gosh, she had so many siblings. My grandma had 10 kids. Morgan attended Children of the Earth High School growing up. I think it's important to recognize that, she was very educated. She knew what she was talking about. She knew what she wanted. She was very confident. But she also grew up within the child welfare system and was failed and neglected from the very beginning. Her grandmother was a residential school survivor, and Morgan was homeless and vulnerable on the streets, and she struggled with mental illness and addictions. She was always on a mission. She could always go from point A to B to C to D, and by the time you got to point B, she was already over at D. She always got what she needed, and everyone in the community loved her for that. Her favorite song was Truly, Madly, Deeply by Savage Garden, which she used to sing in love of her children. That's a photo of my mom and I. I think that was on my first birthday or something. So after reminiscing about Morgan, I got ripped away from Child and Family Services. She used to send me to sleepovers at her sister's, my Aunt Crystal's, on weekends. And that was a weekly thing for years, because my mom needed a break, until one sleepover changed my life in an instantaneous second, just like that. I was 6 years old when we rolled up to my house on Simcoe Street as usual. Only this time my house was surrounded by police and garbage bags full of my life's belongings. I remember seeing the sirens and the bags everywhere and being told to stay in the car and not to get out. And I wasn't allowed to see my mother face to face, but she yelled at me from the front door that she loved me and that she'd get me back. And I remember that so distinctly and clearly. I was sitting in my aunt's car completely as clueless as to what was happening. And I remember my aunt looked at me and told me I was going for a sleepover. This sleepover within the system lasted all the way until I was 21, and I'm 23 years old now. I at 6 years old in the year of 2007 was apprehended and handed over to CFS, where I grew up part of my life with my Aunt Crystal, as well as years in shelters, psych wards, crisis centers, you name it. I was that child who ran and ran and ran to try to get away from my trauma that was being thrown at me unfairly. If you ever wonder why a kid's struggling, look deeper. Look deeper into the root of the cause. Don't look at them as aggressive. Don't look at them as a troubled teen. Look deeper. I would be pushed throughout that system, fighting to survive for my own life, just like my mother Morgan was. And that was tough. That was tough. That's where that life comes full circle. Society had failed my mother Morgan, and those very systems that were meant to protect her failed her. Here's how. Another thing I'd like to recognize. So I was 6 years old, 2007. People don't talk about that after a certain amount of years, you can become a permanent ward. So by the time I was 10, I had no say on where I wanted to live, where I wanted to go, because I was a permanent ward of not only the child welfare system, but I was property of the government of Canada. That's what happens in these systems. Meaning, once you're a permanent ward, your parent can't get you back. That's what happens. So we were victims to those systems. And Morgan Harris was failed from the beginning of her life, as she was pushed throughout the child welfare system, suffering from intergenerational trauma, where she would lose all of her children to the same system she fell into. And she had all of her children taken away from her, at no expense, with little to no supports in place to help someone like her, a young Indigenous woman who had just lost her children to the system in a very traumatic manner. And we hear that story over and over and over again. Indigenous women are being failed. There's no supports for families who just had their children ripped away from them. And why is that? It's a systematic failure. Not only for the parents, but for those children. So that's 2 generations being affected. After a period of time, this led her to losing her home, leaving her homeless on the streets of Winnipeg, unsheltered from those horrors of the world. And that was the tip of the iceberg to Morgan's life. And afterwards, I would grow up hearing tragic stories of my mom, who was on those streets she called home. And they were rough. Some of them I probably could never say, but you don't want to know what Indigenous women go through on the streets. It's scary. So because of everything that she went through, and the abuse and the trauma, she really struggled with mental illness and addictions. And because of this, she was constantly in and out of treatment centers and homeless shelters. She tried repeatedly to get us back, but due to those systematic failures thrown at her, she ended up in that endless and helpless cycle. And sometimes when you fall, you just can't get up. And there's not enough resources out there for our vulnerable people. Morgan had addictions and mental illness, and a lot of our people on the streets do have mental illness, and sometimes it's just medication, sometimes it's a diagnosis, sometimes it's helping them get therapy and counseling, sometimes it's getting them to talk about it, acknowledging that happened to them. Think about what happened and what got them there, because every single person has a story. And she was fighting for her children, but also fighting for her own life on the streets, living in fear of those monsters lurking within society, who were ready to prey on Indigenous women just like her. And she spent her life hiding from sirens and people. And it's scary to know that Indigenous women are preyed upon and that we have such a large statistic on our back. And it's that ignorance and that deeply embedded racism that makes us as Indigenous women feel like we can't speak up, because we were constantly being told, no, this is your fault. That did not happen to you. But why? So she lost her home, and not just the physical kind, but the home in which she found in the comfort of her children. As any parent would, losing her children broke her as it would any other parent. And my mom might have fallen into a cycle of mental health issues and addiction, but it never, ever, ever stopped her in all the years of growing up from being there for me and being a great mother. I didn't care if CFS told me I couldn't see my mom. No one was going to tell me that I could not have a relationship with my mom. She was real and honest, and no matter what she went through. She was real and honest no matter what she went through. And she never hid the things she faced either. I remember her taking me down Main Street and saying, this is what your mom goes through, and this is why I can't be there, and I'll never hide that from you. And while I never quite understood it as a young child because I couldn't wrap my head around it, I do now. It was never her fault, and she taught me how to survive even when I didn't know I needed to. She showed me what to stay away from. She showed me what kind of monsters. She would tell me, no, cross the street, you can't be by that person. And I never got it until I turned 13. And you know what's crazy? As women, we get catcalled a lot more during high school in our younger years than we do as an adult. I haven't been catcalled in how long? Like, it's a true thing, though. Why is that? Like, people are creeps. And that's what happens. And all the trauma that Morgan had to endure during her short period of life is a sacrilege. And what continues to happen to her in death remains a sacrilege. So that's my mom when she attended Children of the Earth High School. And then that's a photo of us at her apartment. I can't remember which street that was. Anyways, that's me on the right and my sister Kira. That's the second oldest sister out of 5. So I have 2 sisters and 2 brothers, actually. So Morgan went missing on May 16, 2022. That's her missing persons poster. She was last seen in Main and Henry, right outside of the shelter. So when she first went missing, something was off, because she was only 5 feet and a mere 100 pounds, and a vulnerable Indigenous woman on the streets at that. So she was my size, even smaller. She was vulnerable and at risk of being exploited on the streets, and she stood no chance against whatever monsters lurked within those shadows of society's walls. And in all the years of her life on the street, she had never, ever, ever once been reported missing, and everyone on those streets knew her and loved her. We checked all the spots, like the shelter, who hadn't seen her in 2 months. She had a bed there. We walked up and down Main Street, checking encampments. We checked scary hotels, bars, buildings, pawn shops, you name it, asking anyone who passed if they recognized her, and the same answer. It was no after no. We recognized Morgan, but we haven't seen her. We were hitting that dead end, which was weird, because I could always go downtown, and it didn't matter what year or what the weather was. I could drive around, and I could always find my mom out there doing something. So, ghosts of the past. I called people on Main Street the ghosts of the past. I see fragments of my mom in everyone I meet. We were searching for her. May 21st, 2022. Bear Clan Patrol, Missing Persons Outreach Organization in Winnipeg, Manitoba, helped my family organize the search, where we were busting down trap house after trap house, where needles were scattered in the dozens across a back lane, along with shady business and people that didn't scare my family away as we asked if they'd seen Morgan. Abandoned buildings where people sleep for shelter, and along the river where people would be forced to move weeks later due to the rising water and rain, like my Aunt Kansas, who was actually staying along that river in a tent, while my mother Morgan was missing. She is a home now, so she's doing much better, but that shows you how close it struck me. It struck my aunt, and it was hard. It was really tough watching her. She was so determined to find my mom going along the river. And underneath bridges where we would find makeshift beds and women's clothing, hoping it might be some clue to where my mom was, but it never was. And I was walking past dozens of missing persons posters only to hand out my mother's Morgan's. But it opened my eyes, and it was all a shocking reminder of the conditions not only my mother Morgan was forced to live in, but the reality our vulnerable people were forced to live in. And so everything I saw broke me and changed me, but it also gave me all of the reason more to continue looking for her. Seasons changed, winter approached, and I kept wondering where she was, but I never gave up hope because when your loved one's missing, that's the only thing you have at the end of the day is that little bit of hope. And so on August 22nd, 2022, I was asked by the Winnipeg Police Service to attend their headquarters to provide a blood sample for their National Missing Persons database. My mom's case was now being looked at as something more, and if for whatever reason her DNA was to show up anywhere, my sample would be the one to identify her. So it was becoming clear to me that my mother, Morgan, might have fallen victim to an unfortunate circumstance. For some reason, I just knew, but I still didn't know why. But you don't go into a headquarters and provide blood for nothing, right? So that leads us to here, December 1st, 2022. I remember the homicide unit and the police sat my family and I down to announce to us that my mother fell victim to a serial killer. I remember Nahani Fontaine, homicide unit, members of my family were all asked to gather there and we were all sat in a circle and that announcement was made and there was just a dead silence. And where is she? That question was asked. And I remember they informed us that they did not actually know where Morgan was. The only thing that they could tell us was that she fell victim to a serial killer who took 3 other women's lives as well. But I remember in my moment of anger, I shouted at those investigators, pointing out that at some point this needed to end. Because throughout my entire life, I had heard the stories of women go missing, to watching the story unfold as they are sometimes found murdered. Only now it had become a shocking and gruesome reality for not only my family, but for the other women's families as well. So that's where that full circle comes in and how life quite literally takes you by the hand and shoves it in your face and says, here, figure it out. And it's messed up. It's really, really messed up. So I had no answers regarding my mother and this traumatized me. I, in that moment, had just spent the last 7 months searching for her to hit another dead end with questions unanswered. And I find myself asking this a lot. Why is this happening to us, to our loved ones, to our families, to our women? Why aren't we worth searching for? What precedent are we setting? What message are we sending to our Indigenous people? And on the same night, we attended the vigil for the lives lost. Right outside the house where her life was taken, the serial killer's house, mere minutes away from my house. I pleaded for her remains to be found as my grief was blasted on national television, but I did it because I was desperate for answers and to find my mother's remains. At that point, I didn't know that my mother was even in a landfill yet. I had nothing other than your mom had fallen victim to a homicide. That was it. That's all I had. So merely days later, on December 5th, 2022, it was announced to my family that my mother, Morgan, and Mercedes Myron's remains were believed to be within the Prairie Green landfill in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and that the Winnipeg Police Service deemed it unfeasible to search for their remains. Morgan and Mercedes were going to remain there for time immemorial. And I'll never forget that day. It was just a very dramatic shift in my life and where I was going. And I never knew that night my life was going to change. And not always in a good way. The following day, my family and I were actually standing inside Parliament Hill begging for the government to act immediately and search for my mother and Mercedes. I even spoke at a political organization in the Assembly of First Nations, where my speech was taken from me by Member of Parliament Leah Gazan to an emergency take-note debate within the House of Commons to read out loud. But that was only the beginning. And that was really surreal, being able to speak on Parliament Hill, to speaking at a conference in front of 2,000 people, and then going and hearing that same speech being read out loud in a House of Commons being debated on. And I remember meeting all those members of Parliament and all of them coming out to send their condolences, and one of them told me, "You're going to burn this house down." And that sat with me, and I didn't get it then. But I kind of do now. So, on December 13th, my family and I, alongside First Nations Indigenous warriors, a warrior movement, protested and blockaded the Brady Road landfill over numerous days, urging the government to act immediately and search for all missing and murdered remains in all landfills, whether it be the Prairie Green or the Brady Road. The collective action worked and shut the landfill down for a couple of weeks, raising awareness. And a lot of people always wonder why Brady. Because I think it's important to recognize that in 2011, an Indigenous woman's remains were deposited in the Brady Road landfill. Tanya Jane Neepanek was only searched for 6 days when they called it off of quits. And her remains lie there in the Brady Road landfill today as the city dumps trash in the surrounding areas. And so I think it's important to acknowledge her. And Linda Beardy, who even after Camp Morgan was set up, was deposited into the Brady landfill in April of 2023. So it's still happening. And that precedent was set 10 years ago. So we set up that camp, and that collective action, protest, whatever you want to call it, worked. And we were really hurting the city's pockets, but it was to put pressure on them. And not even 1 week later, on December 18, 2022, we set up that permanent encampment called Camp Morgan in memory of my mother to continue putting the pressure on all levels of government to retrieve the remains from the landfill. The acknowledgement of remains in the landfill should deem it a crime scene and deem it a gravesite and shut it down inevitably when there is no plan of retrieval for her or Mercedes' remains. It's unsettling to know that more unmarked graves were created in a garbage dump of all places. And Morgan never had a home in the end years of her life and barely had one to call her own growing up. So, Camp Morgan is Morgan's home, as the sacred fire burning there guides her on her journey home to the spirit world until she's retrieved from the landfill. So in Indigenous culture, what I believe is the sacred fire is guiding her to the spirit world. And my mom can't be properly laid to rest because she's lying in a landfill right now and hasn't been given a proper ceremony or a burial. And every human being has the right to have a dignified human burial or dignified burial, right? So feasibility study, I'm not going to read this all, but never ever in the history of Canada, whatever the world, has a family been asked to prove that their loved one is worth finding. What is your mom worth? What's the price tag? How are you going to find your loved one, right? That's what it was kind of telling me. And we did it. The federal government funded it. And we continued pushing for protest and urging action from the government. So we conducted that feasibility study to see what it would cost to conduct a search, how we would do it safely, how it could be done. And it was in fact feasible. And it would be a humanitarian search to look for the remains of Morgan and Mercedes. Because the decision to not search in the beginning was a chalk down to not wanting to interfere with jurisdiction and the serial killer's case and my mom's case. Because there's a whole, we're still going through a court case, right? And nobody can just go in and dig. It's a whole process. And a lot of people don't seem to realize that. Anyways, there's a lot of work that goes into that. But the point is that despite all our efforts in doing everything by the book that was asked of us, my family and I have sat through repetitive meetings over and over, re-traumatizing ourselves with all levels of government officials, etc., you name it. Bureaucracy continues to play a distressing role in all of this, and politics and jurisdiction continue to be a poisonous word when it comes to retrieving my mother from the landfill. And I say poisonous word because I remember in December when I was standing on Parliament Hill and Minister Mark Miller, he was the Minister of Indigenous Relations at that time, but I remember he stood in front of my sister and I, and he said, "It feels uncomfortable for me to stand in front of these Indigenous women with my back turned, when the government has had their back turned on them for so many decades." And he mentioned that jurisdiction continued to play a poisonous word when it came to retrieving them. And so that's just me kind of doing my little thing. So to give you a sheer idea of just how many government officials I've had to sit down with, like, there's Justin Trudeau in the left corner. You can see I'm not too happy. Like, his security is a little scared. There's a photo where they think I'm going to punch him at some point, but, like, I'm expressive with my hands when I talk, and I guess they took that as aggressive, so they didn't like that. My Uncle George is not impressed whatsoever. Chief Cara Wilson, too, doesn't seem to be a fan of him. There's my baby and me and Wab Canoe in the corner, but, like, it just goes to show you how many people I've had to sit down with and repeatedly: Mayor Scott Gillingham, Heather Stephenson, Leah Gazan, Nahani Fontaine, Kevin Klein, Gary Desangri, Mark Miller, and there's more. So this leads us to today. On July 5th, Premier Heather Stephenson decided that her Conservative government would not support a search of the landfill for human remains, deeming it too risky, despite a feasibility study concluding otherwise. And instead, she offered a memorial in place, and the previous premier was fine with the landfill remaining a gravesite for time immemorial. So on the left, there is a photo of the Prairie Green landfill. On the right, there's a photo of me being angry, telling people to search landfills. So that was actually kind of funny because that was immediately after she made that decision. So we held a protest there. And yeah, it added more pressure. So I'd like to note all these protests too are not just protests, they're political actions. They're political actions, and we've had Many different organizations, unions, etc. stand in solidarity with us over the last year, such as like Amnesty International, which is a very large one. There's quite a few. So there was solidarity across Turtle Island, and it sparked a series of protests at the Brady landfill in Winnipeg. And this was all after she made that decision to not search. So after a period of days, an injunction was served to all participants, such as the families, myself, anyone else who was taking part of that. And the injunction was signed by the city of Winnipeg, so Scott Gillingham, allowing the police to arrest any and all participants who did not comply, to which we did because I wasn't going to risk my community's safety. And honestly, it was only the stuff on the road that was the issue. They said, can't work and can stay. You guys just got to get the stuff off the road. And we never shut that landfill down. They had a back entrance that was open, but people didn't realize that, and things get portrayed very differently in the media and online. But that's what happened. So the protest was taken down. Nobody was hurt. Heck, they even took some of our trash away for us. But one small victory was reached. Awareness across Turtle Island. Like they sent a BFI bin, and I was like, well, we may as well use this bin. Get rid of what we need right now. So on September 18, 2023, we held an International Day of Action towards search the landfills in 18 different cities across Turtle Island. Yeah. Grassroots movements and even churches like the United Church of Canada across Turtle Island were standing in solidarity. And that's a hot take. But I appreciate the help at the same time, too, when it comes to the churches, when it comes to that. And I think it's important to figure out how to walk that walk together. My family and I, on the week of September 18th, attended the protests on Parliament Hill in Ottawa, in Montreal, and Toronto. So I literally went from Parliament Hill that same day to Montreal, and then the next day I was in Toronto. And it was cool. And on the International Day of Action, we even met with the Minister of Indigenous Relations, Gary Anandasegri, who had more questions. And I walked out, and that made headlines because I was sick of bureaucracy. I remember I told them, you will not sit me in another room, and you will not sit me down again until you bring something to the table, because I am sick of words with no actions, and I am sick of jurisdiction and bureaucracy and finger pointing going, you're their problem, you're their problem, you're their problem, because that's what was happening. It was going from the province to the city to the feds, and no one could ever take accountability or responsibility. So proof that the injunction and blockade actually did happen. There's the injunction being served and some very fierce supporters lighting on a fire, which I would have did too. But I wasn't there. You know what's funny is I was actually standing behind that crowd when this injunction was being served. And he went and handed it to the wrong person. He didn't even know he was serving the injunction too, which I thought was kind of funny because I was waiting. I was waiting. So anyways, it really opened the eyes of people across Turtle Island. And, I was really appreciative for that because, we went through a lot during those few weeks. We painted Portage and Main. That's the Amnesty International in the top left corner, I believe. That's the blockade on top right. And then the one on the bottom right, I think, was in BC. So imagine doing all that protesting and coming back to Winnipeg and seeing this stand firm against the unsafe 184 million landfill dig. And that was such a highlight in Heather Stephenson's time in office because in a disturbing turn of events after months of backlash from Indigenous communities, but not only Indigenous communities, but people across Turtle Island and worldwide, she decided it was a good idea to release a Stand Firm Against the Landfill Search campaign ad mere weeks before the provincial election. She was using this as her fuel to get votes. She thought she knew what it was to be a true Manitoban, as she calls it. But it didn't work, so in response, this is now displayed on buses and billboards in Winnipeg. Thank you, SCO. I appreciate it. So I think they only had like a 6-month contract, but at one point this was on the back of all buses. This was on some billboards and stuff, and it helped raise awareness because it was like my little huzzah, because I knew she would have to drive by and see those signs. And I knew people who hated this would have to go drive by and see those signs. And you know what? I think it should be put in your face each and every single day until something is done about it. And I did this too for Shine a Light on Women Abuse in London, Ontario. I do a lot of work with organizations too. I did another billboard called Women Are Not Disposable, because we're not. And it's pretty basic, like women should not be treated like trash. And the president that gets set when that does happen, which we'll talk about later. So that first report was blown up out of proportion. It was estimated to be $180 million, which was not really what it was. So the new premier of Manitoba, Wap Kinew, called this into legislative to apologize for the distress and harm caused by the previous government. and also expressed his support to search the Prairie Green. And we needed a secondary report to, I guess, further prove what you would call safety preventative measures, things like blueprints, what kind of like machinery we're going to need, because the first report was very safety oriented and very technical. This one was more about like actually getting it going. And so we actually have a search team called ISN Musquoa. I believe they're from St. Murray, Ontario. And they've been working in collaboration with their families and concluded the study's findings, which once again deemed it feasible and necessary to do so immediately. The only thing we need now is funding to build the facilities to start the search. $90 million. And everyone always goes, oh my God, $90 million, that's a lot of money. But I wouldn't put a price on my mom. And when I ask people what their mom's worth, they would say priceless, right? So why are we putting a price on Indigenous women? And why are we putting a price on retrieving Indigenous women from a landfill? And so this first report was 50 pages, and the second one was 140. I said, since you want a second report, I'm going to give you 20 pages of my own work and give you a timeline of everything that you did wrong over the last 2 years, and this will be in your government database. And the rest of the world will be able to see. So there's a reason it hasn't been released, because they don't want that released. But I did it. But it wasn't enough. They're still lying in a landfill and time is ticking. So I filed 2 complaints of discrimination with the Human Rights Commission against both the Progressive Conservative Party and the provincial government. They were filed by my very good friend Robin Johnson and I for the discrimination and harm faced by not only the PC Party's campaign ad, but also for the overall lack of action towards a search over the last year and more from both the PC Party and provincial government. Because we keep saying we're going to search the landfill, but when are we actually going to do it? It takes a lot to stand in front of media, but where are those actions to back up those words? So the decision to not search the Prairie Green landfill immediately for human remains had set a dangerous precedent for our communities across Turtle Island. And if anyone in the future, for whatever reason, ended up in a landfill, that PC government was not going to search for them. It was setting a dangerous precedent that Indigenous women are trash and less than worth looking for. And it was telling us that if we went missing in the future, no government body would search for us. Anybody. It was telling other serial killers that it's okay to dump Indigenous women's bodies in the landfill. A dangerous message to send. And I don't know, like, I'm still baffled at the end of the day and why they thought this was a good idea in the first place. And families should have never had to have pushed this hard just to simply get their loved one acknowledged. Like, I remember when I had the meeting with Heather Stephenson. She walked in the room wearing a pink bubblegum suit. She didn't even know who I was, which is fine. But what really hurt was she sat down at the table and she looked at me and she said, "Oh, whose family are you with?" I said, "Morgan Harris." She said, "Oh, is that your sister?" And my mother, and she's looking at it and lunge across that table right there. Because if you don't even know the woman that those families are actively fighting for, then do you really care at the end of the day? So there's proof that those were actually filed. I just like to show, because like, this is a legitimate process. It's going to have to go through the Human Rights Commission. They do have option for mediation. I have not heard a word back. But they can say sorry. They have the option. So, words with no action. February 15th, Premier Wab Kinew and Justin Trudeau came to Winnipeg, and for some reason they thought it was a good idea to hold a press conference where a media reporter caught them in a pickle and asked them, "What's your thought on the landfill search?" That's obviously not why they were there, but they got caught in that second, and Wab said he was going to search the landfill at Prairie Green. Trudeau promised to be there as a partner and stood on the sidelines like a weirdo, but to this day, I am still currently waiting for my mom to be retrieved from the landfill, so really only time will tell. And I mentioned this press conference being held because it frustrates me when these government officials come down to our territories but won't acknowledge the active and ongoing problems that are going on right now, like Indigenous women's bodies in landfills. Considering I met him a year ago when I called him out and I stopped him before he tried leaving, and I said, "My mother's lying in a landfill they've known since June of 2022. They didn't tell me until December 1st. And she's still lying there." And I remember the look on his face. So, anyways, that's a little story. It's a whole other story. March 8th, International Women's Day. Because of that conference, I was feeling a little bit frustrated. Because for the last 6 months, they've been saying, we're going to search by summer. We're going to search by winter. We're going to search by June. They kept giving out all these kinds of different answers, but they had nothing to back them up. So it was promise after promise, but no actions. We decided enough was enough. We held an International Day of Action towards Search the Landfills on International Women's Day. We held it in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Toronto, Edmonton, Red Deer, Parliament Hill, Ontario, East Vancouver. And I thought it was so cool to see the strength and unity in our women and the diversity of us across Turtle Island and how we were standing together in solidarity for Search the Landfill because it hit so closely to home. So Wab wasn't too impressed with that. If you watch the video, he gets a little upset. But I had a little win. He promised $500,000 in trauma supports for the upcoming trial. So therapy is expensive. I'm going to need a lot of therapy after this. You know, I go to court literally on Monday, May 6th, and I'm going to be sitting in a room with a serial killer for the next 2 months because the trial is literally around the corner. So we had a meeting scheduled with him on March 25th, 2024, and all levels of government were there. The NDP, the municipal, and federal government, so Mayor Gary Wapkanu and his team, and our Minister Gary, and then Mayor Scott Gillingham. So it was to discuss the search of the Prairie Green landfill again. And I was getting sick of it. I was getting real sick of meetings and being asked to come in. But there was a $40 million commitment towards a search of the landfill, finally. So in Wapkanu's words, we are going to search every cubic meter of where your mom was laying. And I remember him looking at me and saying that. And at that point, it still didn't feel real. And if anything, I was kind of offended. I was offended that we finally got that answer because it was like, what took you so long when all you needed was a yes? Yes, we are going to search. And it hurt. And I called him out and I said, I'm sorry, but $40 million, honestly, it doesn't mean anything to me because I have never had a concept of that kind of money in my life. And I don't care for that kind of dollar sign. I care about bringing my mom home. And that's the point I was trying to get across was why are we still making a big deal out of this dollar sign? Because it still came out. People are still pointing towards that and not the fact that there's women in landfills. Where your trash is going, you're contributing to women's bodies in landfills. That's what's happening. So the upcoming trial. I can't say anything, really. There's a publication ban because I got a big mouth and I don't stop talking. It's true. But my Crown attorney has been very, very sweet, so you'll sleep a little better knowing that we are allowed to wear ribbon skirts in there and stuff. I have very great supports. I have lots of organizations coming forward to help me and the other families as well. It's 2 months long. We talked about those trauma supports that'll go towards our family members, therapy, whatever accommodations we have, because it's 2 months. It's a long time. So keep us in your prayers and good thoughts. And I like to throw, I know we're cutting it close, but I like to throw this in last. So opinion or fact? Freedom of speech is not freedom of speech when it takes away the basic human rights of others to have dignity and respect. And the hate crimes and the normalization of violence towards Indigenous people needs to end. The collective systematic failures and active discrimination / normalization of violence that Indigenous people continue to face across Turtle Island is a continued threat to the overall well-being of Indigenous peoples. And this overall crisis is not just an Indigenous problem, but it's a very disturbing crisis that continues to go on across Turtle Island as we speak. And we each individual, no matter the demographic, have a part in ending it. We need to do better as a society to protect Indigenous communities and continue to speak up for Indigenous communities. So what society might not realize, you can't put a price on the lives of missing and murdered Indigenous women or any person for that matter. And every human being deserves the right to have a dignified burial, no matter the demographic, ethnicity, or background. Ugh. Every human being deserves to feel safe and at home in their communities. Not only that, a lot of people don't talk about this. Silence is a contribution to violence. People always talk about, oh, don't be a snitch. But when you be silent and when you allow this message to fall on deaf ears, you are becoming a part of the problem. If you know a woman's being beat, if you know a woman's being abused, say something. Say something. I don't know how much louder I need to scream it. And our women are considered sacred. We are worthy of being treated as that and more. So, after I've just rambled off, people always ask me, how can we help? You need to become an informed ally. Join community outreach for our vulnerable communities like Bear Clan Patrol, Sabe Peace Walkers, people who walk those streets and talk to our vulnerable people. Share missing persons posters as they happen, because every second counts. Those people begging the world for the rest of the society to look at them and look for them, as we talked in the beginning. Spread that awareness. Instead of making this a one-time conversation, like we're doing right now, make it an everyday conversation. Shout it from the roof of your lungs. Talk about it over and over again, and don't ever be sorry for it. But also have empathy for others. You never know what someone's going through. And acknowledge our vulnerable population. They're humans too. Stay humble. Help amplify Indigenous voices. And be that voice for the voiceless. Speak for those people who aren't here today that can't speak for themselves, or those people who haven't found their voice yet. Maybe that's you. But that's pretty much it. I just wanted to say thank you. Search the landfill. We have a website. We also have a Facebook group. If you're wondering where we're located at Brady. I hope that helped. Good.